Why did the greatest army in the world, equipped with the latest 19th century technology, venture into what seemed like a lifeless desert? Why were vast resources poured into conquering a region that, at first glance, consisted of nothing but sand, rocks, and ruins? Official history offers us the romantic image of Napoleon the Conqueror, a dreamer following in the footsteps of Alexander the Great. However, if we strip away this heroic aura, a different picture emerges. In this story, Bonaparte acts more like the CEO of a giant colonial corporation, whose actions are dictated by cold, economic calculation rather than a thirst for adventure. We are about to see that the wars of the past and the present are written from the exact same cynical script, where true goals are securely hidden behind a facade of beautiful slogans about civilization and enlightenment. Before we rip the masks off our standard history books, subscribe to the channel and hit the like button so you don't miss the truth they are hiding from us. To understand the logic of the 19th century, we just need to look at 21st century geopolitics. Think back to how the French military invasion of Mali was covered in 2012. From our TV screens, we were told about a noble mission, assisting local authorities, fighting radical groups, and protecting civilians. The average citizen sees a heroic rescue operation, but behind the scenes lies an economic foundation: control over incredibly rich uranium deposits. Just as modern industry needs uranium today, centuries ago, empires needed their own critical resources. The scheme remains the same: business interests disguised as humanitarian missions. Traveling back to the era of the Napoleonic Wars, we are met with the claim that the French expedition was looking for a new route to India to spite the British crown. We are told of plans to dig a canal to the Red Sea, but if you look at the map of troop movements, the logic of this version crumbles. If the goal was Suez and access to the sea, the army should have moved exactly there to build a port and a fleet. Instead, after landing in Alexandria, Napoleon leads his legions deep into the continent, into the desert, away from the coast. This looks like complete strategic nonsense, unless his true goal was actually out there, among the sands. There is also the popular theory of simple looting of ancient heritage. It's true that a flood of artifacts poured into Europe from Egypt. Mummies, statues, and golden jewelry filled the museums of Paris, London, and Berlin. But let's be realistic. Stone sphinxes and ancient gold are beautiful, but they do not fuel the economy or a war. Global conflict requires resources to destroy the enemy, not museum exhibits. In the 19th century, during the active conquest of new lands, the most urgent commodity was black powder. Without it, any army turned into a crowd of people, and to produce gunpowder, you absolutely need saltpeter. This is where the geography of the Egyptian campaign reveals the truth. Not far from Alexandria lies a chain of lakes with a telling name: Wadi el Natrun. This strange, almost lifeless place, resembling chemical waste pools, was historically populated by monks. Official legend states that thousands of hermits lived here, weaving baskets from palm leaves brought from far away. The economic absurdity of this scheme is obvious. Why bring raw materials into the desert to make packaging, only to transport it all the way back? Everything falls into place if we assume that the monasteries were not religious abodes, but closed industrial complexes, and the monks were workers. The baskets were actually meant for transporting the saltpeter mined right there. Napoleon's actions confirm this theory. The Mamluks, fighting the French, retreated precisely to these natron lakes, understanding their strategic value. Napoleon's expedition included an unprecedented number of scientists, and the key figure among them was not a historian, but the famous chemist Claude Louis Berthollet. Once on site, he set up gunpowder production using local natural resources. His mission wasn't to study hieroglyphs, but to establish industrial facilities for an uninterrupted supply to the artillery. If you look at Egypt from this angle, it appears not as the cradle of civilization, but as the ruins of a giant ancient industrial complex, destroyed by some unknown catastrophe. Chemical lakes, melted rocks, and strange temples that look more like factory floors. These are all traces of forgotten technologies. Even old texts describing the death of martyrs in these places from fire and smoke sound more like reports of industrial chemical accidents. Napoleon did not come to these ruins as a tourist, but as a crisis manager to seize the remains of a strategic resource. History merely changes the backdrops and the names of the resources, from saltpeter to uranium, but the essence of the colonial machine remains the same. The search for and seizure of energy for dominance. To truly and deeply understand the motives behind events that took place over 200 years ago, we need to take off our rose-colored glasses and look at the mechanisms driving modern geopolitics. History, as we know, tends to repeat itself, and global conflict scenarios are often copied and pasted, with only the dates and backdrops changing. For clarity, let's fast forward to the very recent past, the beginning of the 2010s. On January 11, 2012, world news agencies reported that Paris had sent a military contingent to Mali. The official rhetoric was morally flawless. From TV screens and newspaper front pages, we were told about the urgent need to assist local authorities. It was reported that radical groups had advanced dangerously close to the capital city of Bamako, and only the intervention of European legionnaires could stop the impending chaos. A few months later, in March 2012, the media announced that the contingent would have to stay indefinitely due to stubborn enemy resistance in the north of the country. To an average citizen sitting in a cozy apartment in Paris or Lyon, the picture of the world seemed absolutely clear and noble. The French Republic, faithful to its ideals, was protecting the weak, fighting international extremism, and bringing peace to remote corners of Africa. No one questioned how the life of an ordinary Frenchman depended on the political regime in a distant desert country. The public largely supported the operation, as beautiful slogans about saving humanity always resonate in people's hearts. However, behind this humanitarian facade lay a cold, pragmatic calculation that is never mentioned on the evening news. The true reason for the Foreign Legion's presence in the sands of Mali lies in geology, not ideology. Energy sector experts are well aware that from an exploration standpoint, the subsoil of this African state is among the most promising on the continent. Beneath the sands, which look utterly useless on TV screens, lie colossal uranium deposits. For France, whose energy sector critically depends on nuclear power plants, cheap and accessible uranium is a matter of national security and economic survival. French corporations were effectively securing control over these deposits, disguising it as a counter-terrorism operation. The oligarchic structures needed a resource, and the army was tasked with securing it. Here it is fitting to recall the words of Prussian King Frederick the Great, who once noted, "If soldiers understood the true reasons for the wars they fought, not a single battle would ever take place." This principle of cynical crowd management has remained unchanged for centuries. In the 21st century, the public is sold a fight for democracy to cover up a fight for uranium. In the 19th century, the exact same thing was happening. Napoleon Bonaparte, being not just a general, but a representative of the major financial and industrial groups of his time, operated within the exact same logic. The invasion of Egypt was presented as a civilizational mission, a blow to British trade, or a scientific expedition. But the global economy of that era, just like today's, required fuel for expansion. If today that fuel is uranium for reactors, in the 19th century there was a different strategic resource, without which dominance on the world stage was impossible. A resource worth driving thousands of men into waterless deserts and risking an entire fleet. If they were looking for nuclear energy in Mali, what served the role of uranium during the Napoleonic Wars? The answer to this question turns everything we know about the famous Egyptian campaign completely upside down. Specially trained historians and textbook authors eagerly repeat the same memorized mantra. Napoleon's Egyptian campaign was a brilliant geopolitical move directed against the dominance of the British Empire. We are told that Bonaparte, representing the European military-industrial elite, was looking for a new, shorter, and more convenient route to India. Supposedly, the Directory gave him an ambitious task: to break a path to the Red Sea, establish a colony on its shores, and set up an uninterrupted supply of rich Indian goods to France, bypassing the British-controlled oceans. It sounds logical, grand, and very much in the spirit of the Great Corsican. The plan to create a dual port connecting the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean, a precursor to the Suez Canal, seems like the perfect explanation for the invasion. However, as is often the case with official narratives, this neat logic falls apart the moment you compare the stated goals with the actual movements of the French army on the ground. Let's visualize the map of this region. Here is the Mediterranean Sea. Here is the narrow isthmus of land. And here is the coveted Gulf of the Red Sea with the village of Suez. If Napoleon's main goal was indeed transit to India, the strategy would have been trivially obvious. He should have landed his troops as close to the isthmus as possible, marched straight to Suez, and thrown all his forces into building an outpost right there. It would have been the shortest route, saving time, resources, and soldiers' lives. Any sane strategist dreaming of a fleet in the Red Sea would strive to gain a foothold on its coast. But what do we see in reality? Napoleon's actions completely contradict this logic, almost as if he were intentionally sabotaging the Directory's orders. The landing takes place in Alexandria, which is significantly west of the expected route. Instead of turning east toward the isthmus, the army marches south to Cairo, to the Giza Plateau. This movement is like doing things the most difficult and illogical way possible. The troops do not approach the Red Sea, they move away from it, pushing deeper into the continent. After capturing Cairo and the famous Battle of the Pyramids, instead of turning around and finally heading to Suez, the French make seemingly pointless maneuvers, marching off into the lifeless desert. We are faced with an unsolvable paradox. A man who spent years preparing for this campaign, who gathered a massive commission of the best cartographers, engineers, and scientists of his time, behaves as if he is seeing the map of Africa for the first time. The Directory gives a clear order: capture the isthmus and reach the sea. Napoleon salutes, says target acquired, lands on the shore, and leads a massive army in a completely different direction. How do we make sense of this? There are only two possible explanations, and the first sounds like a joke. We could assume that Napoleon suffered from a severe case of navigational incompetence, that he, a tactical genius, simply got lost, confused north with south, and accidentally led his legions to die in the sands. But to believe that a commander of his caliber, surrounded by a staff of professionals, simply got confused is impossible. This leaves the second option, which is far more cynical and pragmatic. Napoleon knew exactly where he was going. He was perfectly oriented, and if he didn't go to the Red Sea, it means he didn't need the Red Sea. His true goal lay not on the trade routes to India, but right where he so stubbornly drove his soldiers, deep in the desert, among the sand and ancient ruins. If we discard the geopolitical route to India theory as invalid due to the obvious inconsistency of the route, we have to look for another explanation. When an army invades a foreign country without pursuing strategic transport goals, the simplest and oldest occupation of conquerors usually comes to mind: looting. Could it be that Napoleon didn't make a mistake at all, and his main objective was just industrial-scale plunder? After all, rumors of the untold treasures of the pharaohs had excited the minds of Europeans for centuries. The theory that the main goal of the Egyptian campaign was the basic looting of Cairo and the Valley of the Pyramids sounds quite convincing and, at first glance, is supported by the facts. Indeed, right after the visit of the Napoleonic army, an endless stream of ancient artifacts flooded into Europe. Everything that could be loaded onto ships was taken out of Egypt. Mysterious mummies, granite statues, golden jewelry, massive sarcophagi, and painted papyri. All of this was continuously shipped to St. Petersburg, Rome, Berlin, London, and, of course, Paris. There is a persistent feeling that Egypt was a sort of ancient piggy bank that many knew about but were afraid to touch. Until Bonaparte came along, smashed it open, and declared, "There's enough here for everyone. Take what you want." However, if we look away from the museum aesthetics and view the situation through the eyes of the pragmatic managers of the 19th century global economy, this theory begins to burst at the seams. Ancient artifacts are, of course, nice things to have. You can decorate a park with a beautiful granite stele, or put a spooky mummy in a museum lobby to attract the public. But let's be honest. Despite all their historical value and mysterious beauty, a stone sphinx beard or a gilded pharaoh's mask has absolutely no ability to influence macroeconomic processes. What will change on the world stock markets just because every provincial European town gets its own sarcophagus? Absolutely nothing. Artifacts are prestige, not capital capable of recouping the colossal costs of outfitting a fleet and a massive army. The global directory of the 19th century, sending its legions to the ends of the earth, needed real assets, not pretty trinkets. At that time, an active, aggressive redistribution of the world was underway. Colonizing new lands required not so much diplomacy as brute force. The local populations, whether in Africa or Asia, often put up desperate resistance to the invaders. This meant that conquering territories required the constant, uninterrupted use of firearms. Warfare had entered an industrial phase, where the victor was the one whose cannons kept firing the longest. And what is the main component of 19th century firepower? Black powder. Without it, the most disciplined, best-dressed, and best-trained army in the world instantly turned into a useless crowd of men in bright uniforms armed only with bayonets. Essentially, sticks with sharp tips. Against a numerous enemy, such an army was doomed. Consequently, the vital necessity of any empire was uninterrupted access to the components of gunpowder. And while coal and sulfur were relatively accessible, the third and main component, saltpeter, was a true strategic deficit. Saltpeter was the very air without which the French military machine suffocated. Control over large saltpeter deposits in the 19th century was as important as control over oil wells in the 20th century, or uranium mines in the 21st. A global army desperately needed a source of this substance to continue its expansion. Napoleon, being not only a commander but also an excellent artilleryman, understood this better than anyone. He didn't need a port, India, or dead men's gold. He needed gunpowder. And it was this chemical hunger that made him turn his attention to a specific point on the map, which perfectly explains all the oddities of his route. If we carefully track the logic behind the landing of French troops, it becomes obvious that Napoleon made no mistake in choosing his beachhead. His actions were calculated with surgical precision. Not far from Alexandria, where the French ships arrived, lies a chain of water bodies with a highly significant name, Wadi el Natrun. Even today, this place raises more questions than it answers. Modern guidebooks might call them garden lakes, but anyone who sees them in person or studies the geological reports will understand. This is no resort area. It is a harsh desert, in the middle of which lie strange bodies of water. that look more like industrial chemical waste pools than natural oases. The water here is so saturated with salts and minerals that normal life is practically impossible. And yet, in this seemingly uninhabitable place, there was historically an incredible concentration of human resources. We are told that before Napoleon's arrival, these lands bore the telling name of Nitria. Here, in the area of the chemical lakes, there were about 50 monasteries, housing, by various estimates, up to 10,000 monks. That is an actual army of hermits. A logical question arises. What were 10,000 healthy men doing in a place where there is nothing but salt and sand? What did they eat? And more importantly, how did they make a living? Official history offers us a version that, upon closer inspection, seems like an insult to common sense. We are told that the monks of the Nitrian desert earned their living by weaving baskets and bags. Supposedly, they brought palm leaves from far away, wove them into containers, and then sold these products. Let's apply some logistical thinking. Monks voluntarily go into a remote desert, far from trade routes, to a place where palms do not grow on an industrial scale. Then they organize a complex and expensive delivery of raw materials, palm leaves, across the sands to their monasteries. There they engage in manual labor, turning leaves into baskets. And after that, the finished products must be transported back across the same desert to the consumer, because there are no buyers in Nitria itself. Doesn't this business model seem, to put it mildly, insane? Setting up production of simple packaging at a huge distance from the sources of raw materials and sales markets is economic suicide. There isn't even a river here to float the goods down, just scorching sand. But this scheme instantly stops being absurd if we change one variable. What if the monks were not just religious fanatics weaving useless baskets, but workers in a closed industrial cycle? And the monasteries were not abodes of prayer, but fortified factories and warehouse complexes. In that case, everything falls into place. The seemingly eccentric monks miraculously transform into employees of enterprises dedicated to the extraction and processing of strategic raw materials. This is exactly why palm leaves were brought here, not for the art of weaving, but for manufacturing industrial packaging. These baskets and bags were loaded not with air or prayers, but with the very saltpeter and natron that were extracted from the local chemical lakes. Then this precious substance, packed in palm containers, was shipped to gunpowder factories. Wadi El Natroun was not a religious center, but a giant open-air chemical plant disguised as holy ground. It was this resource that lured conquerors of all stripes. But is there any documentary evidence that Napoleon was specifically after this chemistry and not just taking a walk in the desert? The proof exists, and it is hidden in the names of the people who accompanied the emperor. Even the most skeptical defenders of official history cannot ignore the dry facts of military dispatches from that time, which upon closer examination turn into irrefutable evidence. If we turn to the chronicles of the Egyptian campaign, we find an extremely curious detail regarding the movement of enemy troops. When the French army began to push back the local rulers, the Mamluks, their leaders, Osman Bey and Murad Bey, did not flee to the deep rear or to the borders of neighboring states. Their units began to regroup with the clear intention of moving toward those very natron lakes. The Mamluks, who knew their land perfectly, were not retreating into the void, but toward the source of their power. They sought to maintain control over Wadi El Natroun because they understood, whoever controls this place controls an endless supply of ammunition. Napoleon, a tactical genius, decoded this maneuver and moved his forces to intercept, cutting the enemy off from their main strategic resource. But the strongest evidence of the expedition's true goals comes from the personnel of the invading army. Napoleon took an unprecedented number of civilian specialists with him to Africa, the so-called Commission of Sciences and Arts. We love to be told about painters, linguists, and historians who supposedly went to sketch the Sphinx. However, in the shadow of these romantic professions hides a figure whose presence completely changes the meaning of the entire operation. The main star of the scientific delegation was not a poet or an archaeologist, but Claude Louis Berthollet, an outstanding chemist of his time. This was the same man who had recently created Berthollet's salt, potassium chlorate, a highly explosive substance. Why would a general marching to war drag a huge chemical laboratory and a polytechnic school professor across the sea? The answer is simple and cynical. Berthollet didn't go to study the past. He went to secure the future of the French artillery. In their memoirs and reports, participants of the campaign, such as André-François Milhaud, explicitly state, Berthollet brought reagents and equipment with a specific goal: to establish gunpowder production right on the spot in Cairo. And he accomplished this task brilliantly. As soon as French troops occupied the region, General Andreossi received an unambiguous order to inspect the saltpeter lakes. Chemists followed the military there. They took soil samples, analyzed the water composition in those monastery waste pools, and confirmed their industrial value. Berthollet, along with the engineer Conté, built several factories in record time. The French army ceased to depend on supplies from the motherland, beginning to produce explosives from local raw materials. The chemists weren't wasting time deciphering hieroglyphs. They were analyzing desert sands and processing natron. Thus, Berthollet's presence and the deployment of chemical production are the smoke that leads us to the fire of truth. The Egyptian campaign was not a cultural mission, but a hostile corporate raid on a giant chemical plant. And this discovery forces us to look completely differently not only at the Napoleonic Wars, but at the past of Egypt itself. If in the 19th century they were extracting raw materials for gunpowder here using ancient infrastructure, what kind of civilization left behind such technological ruins? We are approaching the boldest part of our investigation. An association with the cult novel Roadside Picnic by the Strugatsky brothers inevitably comes to mind. If we cast aside everything we were taught in school and look at 19th century Egypt with an unbiased eye, what we see is not the cradle of ancient spirituality, but a gigantic, abandoned, and partially destroyed industrial zone. Imagine a territory where a high-tech production complex once operated, but for some unknown reason, be it war, sabotage, or an industrial disaster, it was destroyed. Years, perhaps centuries passed, and new people arrived at these ruins. They see the remains of gigantic structures they don't understand, find strange reservoirs with chemicals, and, not understanding their true purpose, begin to attribute sacred meaning to them. Those very Wadi El Natrun lakes we discussed earlier cease to be natural water bodies in this worldview. They are typical industrial waste pools, slurry storage sites where waste was dumped or where reagent crystallization took place. The strange temples with their cyclopean masonry, narrow corridors, and huge windowless halls look more like factory floors, bunkers, or power stations than places for prayer. The obelisks and statues that amaze us with the precision of their hard rock carving might not just be monuments to kings, but components of technical structures whose functional purpose has been lost. We are only seeing the stone shell, the casing of a mechanism from which all the internal workings were removed long ago. This theory sounds especially chilling and plausible if we try to decode ancient religious texts as dry incident reports. Take, for example, the story of the 10,000 martyrs of the Nitrian desert. Church tradition states that under the Alexandrian patriarch Theophilus, a huge number of monks living in the area of those chemical lakes were accused of heresy and died a martyr's death. But look at the details of their demise. Sources report that they died from fire and smoke. In the context of religious persecution, this is usually interpreted as being burned alive or attacked. But if we keep the chemical plant hypothesis in mind, the picture changes radically. 10,000 workers concentrated in one place, fire and smoke, in an area where highly explosive saltpeter is mined. This is a textbook description of a major industrial disaster. Most likely, a massive explosion or a release of toxic substances occurred at the Wadi El Natroun plant, instantly wiping out the personnel of a huge enterprise. Later, as the true meaning of the events was forgotten, history turned the dead workers into holy martyrs, and the site of the accident into a sacred desert. In the 19th century, Napoleon arrived at these industrial ruins. He wasn't an explorer, he was a high-ranking looter, a stalker, who was the first to realize that there was still something of value left in the zone. He saw that the slurry lakes were still full of saltpeter, and that within the ruins, one could find technologies or finished products far ahead of their time. What could be taken away was shipped to Europe under the guise of artwork. What couldn't be moved was blown up or disfigured beyond recognition to hide the true purpose of the objects, turning functional structures into meaningless piles of stone. Bonaparte wasn't discovering the history of ancient Egypt. He was clearing the territory and taking the remnants of technologies that could empower his empire. It wasn't archaeology, it was industrial espionage in the ruins of a dead civilization. Summing up this massive investigation, the puzzle finally comes together into a single, terrifyingly logical picture. Now we can confidently throw away the romantic nonsense from school textbooks about the dreamy Corsican who ventured into the sands to stand in the shadow of the pyramids and ponder eternity. Napoleon Bonaparte was looking for something very specific and tangible in Egypt, something upon which the survival and dominance of his empire depended. He was looking for, and most importantly found, the main resource of 19th century warfare: saltpeter. This entire grand Egyptian campaign, celebrated in paintings and poems, was essentially nothing more than a corporate raid on a giant chemical plant, cynically disguised as a scientific and liberation expedition. The Great Army was not paving the way for civilization. It was paving the way to raw materials. The Commission of Sciences accompanying the troops was actually functioning as geological surveyors and an engineering corps for setting up production. Monasteries turned out to be factories, lakes were waste pools, and ancient artifacts were either byproducts or technological remnants taken as trophies by the victors. We see not the triumph of European culture over Eastern barbarism, but a dry report on the acquisition of assets. Control over Wadi El Natroun secured gunpowder for France, allowing the Napoleonic military machine to redraw the map of Europe for another decade and a half. The saddest and most sobering thing about this story is how cyclical it is. Eras change, soldiers' uniforms and state flags change, territory names change, whether it's Mali, Iraq, Libya, or Egypt. Even the names of critical resources change. Yesterday it was saltpeter for muskets and cannons. In the 20th century, it was black gold for internal combustion engines. And today, it's uranium for nuclear reactors or lithium for batteries. But the essence of what is happening remains as unchanging as the Sphinx frozen in stone. Global players always act according to the exact same script. First, a beautiful legend is created for the public. The fight against tyranny, the defense of faith, exporting democracy, or helping backward nations. Under the cover of these noble slogans, the invasion begins, and in the finale, we always find that the richest deposits of strategic raw materials have accidentally fallen under the control of the liberators. The history of our world is not a chronicle of heroic deeds, but an accounting ledger where profits are paid in blood and robbery is called geopolitics. We live in a world where crazy theories often turn out to be much closer to reality than official documents stamped with government seals. With this, we conclude our analysis of the true motives behind Napoleon's invasion. But this is just one page in a thick book of falsifications that we have yet to reread. If you found this version of events convincing and logical, Or, on the contrary, if you think it's total fantasy and nonsense, be sure to write your detailed opinion in the comments. Argument gives birth to truth. And of course, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss new episodes. Ahead, we have many more exposés of the crazy history of our world that you will never be taught in history class.